where he had seen the discs, hundreds of thin sheets of platinum bound together by a single ring through the top. Reaching down, he lifted them, amazed at their lightness. Then his heart almost stopped beating, when a bloody hand reached up from the pile of treasure and grasped his wrist. "Help me!" He could not hear the voice, so much as sensed the thought. Grasping Raistlin's hand, he pulled the mage to his feet. Blood was visible through the red of Raistlin's robe, but he did not appear to be seriously injured. At least he could stand. But could he walk? Sturm needed help. He wondered where the others were. He couldn't see them in the brilliance. Suddenly, Caraman loomed by his side, his armor gleaming in the blue flame. Raistlin clutched at him. "Help me find the spellbook," he hissed. "Who cares about that?" Caraman roared, reaching for his brother. "I'll get you out of here." Raistlin's mouth twisted so in fury and frustration that he could not speak. He dropped to his knees and began to search frantically through the pile of treasure. Caraman tried to draw him away, but Raistlin shoved him back with his frail hand. And still, the ringing sound pierced their ears. Sturm felt tears of pain trickle down his cheeks. Suddenly, something crashed to the floor in front of the knight. The chamber's ceiling was collapsing. The entire building shook around them, the ringing sound causing the pillars to tremble and the walls to crack. Then the ringing died, and with it, the dragon. Kisanth had vanished, leaving behind nothing but a pile of smoldering ash. Sturm gasped in relief, but not for long. As soon as the ringing sound ended, he could hear the sounds of the palace caving in, the cracking of the ceiling, and the thuds and explosive crashes of huge stone slabs struck the floor. Then, out of the dust and noise, Tanis appeared before him. Blood trickled from a cut on the half-elf's cheek. Sturm grabbed his friend and pulled him to the altar as another chunk of ceiling plummeted near them. "The whole city is collapsing!" Sturm yelled. "How do we get out?" Tanis shook his head. "The only way I know is back the way we came, through that tunnel," he shouted. He ducked as another piece of steel crashed onto the empty altar. "That'll be a death trap. There must be another way." "We'll find it," Tanis said firmly. He peered through the billowing dust. "Where are the others?" he asked. Then, turning, he saw Raistlin and Caraman. Tanis stared in horror and disgust at the mage scavenging among the treasure. Then he saw a small figure tugging Raistlin's sleeve. Bopoo. Tanis made a lunge for her, nearly scaring the gully dwarf witless. She shrank back against Raistlin with a startled scream. "We've got to get out of here!" Tanis roared. He grabbed hold of Raistlin's robes and dragged the slender young man to his feet. "Stop looting and get that gully dwarf of yours to show us the way out, or so help me, you'll die by my hands." Raistlin's thin lips parted in a ghastly smile as Tanis flung him back against the altar. Bopoo shrieked. "Come, we go! On our way!" "Raist," Caraman begged. "You can't find it. You'll die if we don't get out of here." "Very well," the mage snarled. He lifted the staff of Magius from the altar and stood up, reaching out his arm for his brother's aid. "Bopoo, show us the way," he commanded. "Raistlin, light your staff so we can follow you," Tanis ordered. "I'm going to find the others." "Over there," Caraman said grimly. "You're going to need help with the plainsmen." Tanis flung his arm over his face as more stone fell, then jumped across the rubble. He found Riverwind collapsed where Gold Moon had been standing. Flint and Tasselhoff trying to get the plainsman to his feet. There was nothing there now, except a large area of blackened stone. Gold Moon had been totally consumed in the flames. "Is he alive?" Tanis shouted. "Yes," Tas answered, his voice carrying shrilly above the noise. "But he won't move." "I'll talk to him," Tanis said. Follow the others. We'll be there in a moment. Go on. Tasselhoff hesitated, but Flint, after a glance at Tanis's face, put his hand on the Kender's arm. Snuffling, Tas turned and began running through the rubble with the dwarf. Tanis knelt beside Riverwind. Then the half-elf glanced up as Sturm appeared out of the gloom. Go on, Tanis said. You're in command now. Sturm hesitated. A column toppled over near them, showering them in rock dust. Tanis flung his body across Riverwind's. Go on, he yelled at Sturm. I'm holding you responsible. Sturm drew a breath, laid a hand on Tanis's shoulder, then ran toward the light from Raistlin's staff. The knight found the others huddled in a narrow hallway. The arched ceiling above them seemed to be holding together, but Sturm could hear thudding sounds above. The ground shook beneath their feet, and little rivulets of water were beginning to seep through new cracks in the walls. Where's Tanis? Karaman asked. He'll be along, Sturm said harshly. We'll wait. A few moments at least. He did not mention that he would wait until waiting had dissolved into death. There was a shattering crack. Water began to gush through the wall, flooding the floor. Sturm was about to order the others out when a figure emerged from the collapsing doorway. It was Riverwind, carrying Tanis's inert body in his arms. What happened? Sturm leaped forward, his throat constricting. He's not. He stayed with me, Riverwind said softly. I told him to leave. I wanted to die, there with her. Then, a slab of stone. He never saw it. I'll carry him, Karaman said. No! Riverwind glared at the big warrior. His arms gripped Tanis's body tighter. I will carry him. We must go. Yes, this way. We go now, urged the Golly dwarf. She led them out of the city that was dying a second time. They emerged from the dragon's lair into the plaza, which was rapidly being submerged as new sea poured into the crumbling cavern. The companions waded across, holding on to each other to keep from being swept away in the vicious current. Howling gully dwarves swarmed everywhere in a state of wild confusion, some getting caught in the current, others climbing up into the top stories of shaking buildings, still others dashing down the streets. Sturm could think of only one way out. Go east, he shouted, gesturing down the broad street that led to the waterfall. He looked anxiously at Riverwind. The dazed plainsman seemed oblivious to the commotion around him. Tanis was unconscious, maybe dead. Fear chilled Sturm's blood, but he forcibly suppressed all emotions. The knight ran ahead, catching up with the twins. Our only chance is the lift, he yelled. Karaman nodded slowly. It will mean a fight. Yes, damn it, said Sturm in exasperation, envisioning all of the Draconians trying to leave this stricken city. It will mean a fight. You got any better ideas? Karaman shook his head. At a corner, Sturm waited to herd his limping, exhausted band in the right direction. Peering through the dust and mist, he could see the lift ahead of them. It was, as he had foreseen, surrounded by a dark, writhing mass of Draconians. Fortunately, they were all intent on escape. They had to strike quickly, Sturm knew, to catch the creatures off guard. Timing was critical. He caught hold of the kender as Tas scurried past. Tas, he yelled, we're going up the lift. Tasselhoff nodded to show he understood, then made a face to imitate a Draconian and slashed his hand across his throat. When we get near, Sturm shouted, sneak around to where you can see the pot descending. When it starts to come down, signal me. We'll attack when it reaches the ground. Tasselhoff's top knot bobbed. Tell Flint, Sturm finished, his voice nearly gone from shouting. Tass nodded again and raced off to find the dwarf. Sturm straightened his aching back with a sigh and continued on down the street. He could see about 20 or 25 Draconians gathered in the courtyard, watching for the pot that would carry them to safety to begin its descent. Sturm imagined the confusion up on the top, Draconians whipping and bullying the panic-stricken gully dwarves, forcing them into the lift. He hoped the confusion would last. Sturm saw the brothers in the shadow at the edge of the courtyard. He joined them, glancing up nervously as a stone slab crashed down behind him. As Riverwind staggered out of the mist and dust, Sturm started to help him, but the plainsman looked at the knight as if he had never seen him before in his life. "Bring Tanis over here," Sturm said. "You can lay him down and rest a moment. We're going up in the lift, and we'll have a fight on our hands. Wait here. When we signal, do what you must." Riverwind interrupted coldly. He laid Tanis's body gently on the ground and slumped down beside him,
Hey, Christopher.
burying his face in his hands. Sturm hesitated. He started to kneel down by Tanis as Flint came to stand by his side. "Go on, I'll check on him," the dwarf offered. Sturm nodded thankfully. He saw Tasselhoff skitter across the courtyard and into a doorway. Looking toward the lift, he saw the Draconians yelling and cursing into the mist as if they could hurry the pot's descent. Flint poked Sturm in the ribs. "How are we going to fight all of them?" he shouted. "We're not. You're going to stay here with Riverwind and Tanis," Sturm said. "Caraman and I can handle this," he added, wishing he believed it himself. "And I," whispered the mage. "I still have my spells."
Bravo, Chris. Bonsoir. J'espère que tu vas bien.
"You'll have my spells." The knight did not answer. He distrusted magic and he distrusted Raistland. Still, he had no choice. Caraman would not go into battle without his brother by his side. Tugging at his mustaches,
Hope you're
Sturm
doing good, Chris.
restlessly loosened his sword. Caraman flexed his arms, clenching and unclenching his huge hands. Raistland, his eyes closed, was lost in concentration. Fufu, hidden in a niche in the wall behind him, watched everything with wide, frightened eyes. The pot swung into view, gully dwarves hanging from its sides. As Sturm hoped, the Draconians on the ground began to fight among themselves, none wanting to be left behind. Their panic increased as great cracks ran through the pavement toward them. Water rose through the cracks. The city of Zaktsaroth would soon be lying at the bottom of New Sea. As the pot touched ground, the gully dwarves scurried over the sides and fled.
Give me 1
The
second.
Draconians clambered in, hitting and shoving each other. "Now!" the knight yelled. "Get out of my way!" the mage hissed. Pulling a handful of sand from one of his pockets, he sprinkled it on the ground and whispered, "Astasark, Sinora Lan Krina," moving his right hand in an arc in the direction of the Draconians. First one, then a few more blinked their eyes and slumped to the ground in sleep. But others remained standing, glancing around in alarm. The mage ducked back into the doorway and, seeing nothing, the Draconians turned back to the lift, stepping on the bodies of their sleeping comrades in their frantic rush. Raistland leaned against the wall, closing his eyes wearily. "How many?" he asked. "Only about 6. Caraman drew his sword from his sheath. "Just get in the damn pot," Sturm yelled. "We'll come back for Tanis when the fight's ended." Under cover of the mist, the 2 warriors, swords drawn, covered the distance to the Draconians within a few heartbeats. Raistland stumbling behind. Sturm shouted his battle cry. At the sound, the Draconians spun around in alarm, and Riverwind raised his head. The sound of battle penetrated Riverwind's fog of despair. The plainsman saw Gold Moon before him, dying in the blue flame. The dead expression left his face, replaced by a ferocity so bestial and terrifying that Boo-Poo, still hiding in the doorway, screamed in alarm. Riverwind leaped to his feet. He didn't even draw his sword, but charged forward, empty-handed. He tore into the ranks of the scrambling Draconians like a starving panther and began to kill. He killed with his bare hands, twisting, choking, gouging. Draconians stabbed at him with their swords. Soon his leather tunic was soaked with blood, yet he never stopped moving among them, never stopped killing. His face was that of a madman. The Draconians in Riverwind's path saw death in his eyes, and they also saw that their weapons had no effect. One broke and ran, and soon another. Sturm, finishing an opponent, looked up, prepared to find 6 more coming at him. Instead, he saw the enemy fleeing for their lives into the mist. Riverwind, covered with blood, collapsed onto the ground. The mage pointed. It was hovering about 2 feet off the ground and starting to move upward. There were gully dwarfs in the top. Stop it! Tasselhoff raced from his hiding place and leaped for the edge. He clung, his feet dangling, trying to keep the empty pot from rising. Caraman, hang on to it! Sturm ordered the warrior. I'll get Tanis. I can hold it, but not for long. The big man grunted, grasping onto the edge and digging his feet into the ground. He dragged the lift to a halt. Tasselhoff climbed inside, hoping his small body might add ballast. Sturm ran back swiftly to Tanis. Flint was beside him, his axe in his hands. He's alive, the dwarf called as the knight approached. Sturm paused a moment to thank some god somewhere. Then he and Flint lifted the unconscious half-elf and carried him. They placed him inside, then returned for Riverwind. It took 4
It definitely rips
Riverwind's
pretty good.
bloody body into the lift. Tass tried without much success to stanch the wounds with one of his handkerchiefs. Hurry! Caraman gasped. Despite all his efforts, the pot was rising slowly. Get in, Sturm ordered Raistland. The mage glanced at him coldly and ran back into the mist.
But I won that over the
In
weekend,
He
or last
reappeared,
weekend.
carrying Boo-Poo in his arms. The knight grabbed the trembling gully dwarf and flung her into the lift. Boo-Poo, whimpering, crouched on the bottom, still clutching her bag to her chest. Raistland climbed over the side. The pot continued to rise. Caraman's arms were nearly pulled out of their sockets. Go on, Sturm
pretty
ordered
much.
Caraman. The knight, being the last to leave the
I
field
load
of battle,
this,
as usual.
then I put it in there.
Caraman knew better than to argue. He heaved himself up, nearly tipping the pot over. Flint and Raistland dragged him in. Without Caraman holding it, the pot lunged upward rapidly. Sturm caught hold of it with both hands and clung to the side as it rose into the air. After 2 or 3 tries, he managed to swing a leg over the edge and climbed in with Caraman's help. The knight knelt down beside Tanis
But
and was
I got
relieved beyond expression to see the half-elf stir and
I did a
Sturm
raffle
grasped
ticket,
the half-elf and held him close.
and I
You
won
have
it.
no idea how glad I am you're back, the knight said, his voice husky. Riverwind? Tanis murmured, groggily. He's here. He saved your life. He saved all our lives. Sturm talked rapidly, almost incoherently. We're in the lift, going up. The city's destroyed. Where are you hurt? Broken ribs. Feels like. Wincing in pain, Tanis looked over at Riverwind, still conscious despite his wounds. Poor man, Tanis said softly. Gold moon. I saw her die, Sturm. There was nothing I could do. Sturm helped the half-elf rise to his feet. We have the discs, the knight said firmly. It was what she wanted, what she fought for. They're in my pack. Are you sure you can stand? Yes, Tanis said. He drew a ragged, painful breath. We have the discs. Whatever good that will do us. They were interrupted by the shrill screams as the second pot, gully dwarves flying like banners, went past them. The gully dwarves shook their fists and cursed the companions. Boo-Poo laughed. Then she stood up, looking at Raistlin in concern. The mage leaned wearily against the side of the pot, his lips moving silently, calling to mind another spell. Sturm peered up through the mist. I wonder how many will be at the top, he asked. Tanis, too, glanced up. Most have fled, I hope, he said. He caught his breath sharply and clutched at his ribs. There was a sudden lurch. The pot fell about a foot, stopped with a jolt, then slowly started to rise again. The companions looked at each other in alarm. The mechanism. It's either starting to collapse or the Draconians have recognized us and are trying to destroy it, Tanis said. There's nothing we can do, Sturm said in bitter frustration. He stared down at the pack containing the discs, which lay at his feet. Except pray to these gods. The pot lurched and dropped again. For a moment it hung, suspended, swaying in the mist-shrouded air. Then it started up, moving slowly, shuddering. The companions could see the edge of the rock ledge and the opening above them. The pot rose inch by creaking inch, each of those inside mentally supporting every link of the chain that was carrying them up to... Draconians! Cried Tass shrilly, pointing up. Two Draconians stared down at them. As the pot crept closer and closer, Tanis saw the Draconians crouch, ready to jump. They're going to leap down here. The pot won't hold, Flint rumbled. We'll crash. That may be their intent, Tanis said. They have wings. Stand back, Raistlin said, staggering to his feet. Raist, don't! His brother caught hold of him. You're too weak. I have strength for one more spell, the mage whispered. But it may not work. If they see I am Magi, they may be able to resist my magic. Hide behind Caraman's shield, Tanis said swiftly. The big man thrust his body and his shield in front of his
How have
brother.
you been doing,
The
Chris?
mist swirled around them,
Hope you've
concealing
been
them
doing
from
well.
Draconian eyes, but also preventing them from seeing the Draconians. The pot rose, inch by inch, the chain creaking and lurching upward. Raistlin stood poised behind Caraman's shield, his strange eyes staring, waiting for the mists to part. Cool air touched Tanis's cheek. A breeze swirled the mists apart, just for an instant. The Draconians were so close they could have almost touched them. The Draconians saw them at the same time. One spread its wings and floated down toward the pot, sword in hand, shrieking in triumph. Raistlin spoke. Caraman moved his shield, and the mage spread his thin fingers. A ball of white shot from his hands, hitting the Draconian squarely in the chest. The ball exploded, covering the creature in sticky webbing. Its cry of triumph changed to a horrifying shriek as the webbing tangled its wings. It plummeted into the mist, its body striking the edge of the iron pot as it fell. The pot began to rock and sway. "There's still one more," Raistland gasped, sinking to his knees. "Hold me up, Caraman. Help me stand." The mage began to cough violently, blood trickling from his mouth. "Raist," his brother pleaded, dropping his shield and catching his fainting twin. "Stop. There's nothing you can do. You'll kill yourself." A look of command was enough. The warrior supported his brother as the mage began to speak again, the eerie-sounding language of magic. The remaining Draconian hesitated, still hearing the yells of its fallen companion. It knew the human was a magic user. It also knew that it could probably resist the magic. But this human facing it was like no human magic user it had ever encountered. The human's body seemed weak, practically to the point of death, but a strong aura of power surrounded him. The mage raised his hand, pointing at the creature. The Draconian cast one last vicious glance at the companions, then turned and fled. Raistland, unconscious, sank into his brother's arms as the pot completed its journey to the surface. Chapter 22. Boo-Poo's Gift, an ominous sight. Just as they pulled Riverwind out of the lift, a sharp tremor shook the floor of the Hall of the Ancestors. The companions, dragging Riverwind with them, scrambled back as the floor cracked. The floor gave way and tumbled down, carrying the great wheel and the iron pots down into the mist below. "This whole place is caving in," Caraman shouted in alarm, holding his brother in his arms. "Run! Back to the Temple of Mishikal!" Tanis gasped with pain. "Trusting in the gods again, huh?" Flint said. Tanis could not answer. Sturm took hold of Riverwind's arms and started to lift him, but the plainsman shook his head and shoved him away. "My wounds are not serious. I can manage. Leave me." He remained slumped on the shattered floor. Tanis glanced questioningly at Sturm. The knight shrugged. The Solamnic knights considered suicide noble and honorable. The elves considered it blasphemy. The half-elf took hold of the plainsman's long, dark hair and jerked his head back, so that the startled man was forced to look into Tanis's eyes. "Go ahead. Lie down and die," Tanis said through clenched teeth. "Shame your chieftain. She at least had the courage to fight." Riverwind's eyes smoldered. He caught hold of Tanis's wrist and flung the half-elf away from him with such force that Tanis staggered into the wall, groaning in agony. The plainsman stood up, staring at Tanis with hatred. Then he turned and stumbled down the shaking corridor, his head bent. Sturm helped Tanis to his feet, the half-elf dizzy from the pain. They followed the others as fast as they could. The floor tilted crazily. When Sturm slipped, they crashed against a wall. A sarcophagus slid out into the hallway, spilling its grisly contents. A skull rolled over by Tanis's feet, startling the half-elf, who fell to his knees. He feared he might faint from the pain. "Go," he tried to say to Sturm, but he couldn't talk. The knight picked him up, and together they staggered on through the dust-choked corridor. At the foot of the stairs, called the Paths of the Dead, they found Tasselhoff waiting. "The others?" Sturm gasped, coughing in the dust. "They've already gone up to the temple," Tasselhoff said. "Caraman told me to wait here for you. Flint says the temple's safe. Dwarven stonework, you know. Raistland's conscious." He said it was safe too. Something about being held in the palm of the goddess. Riverwind's there. He glared at me. I think he could have killed me. But he made it up the stairs. All right, Tanis said to stop the prattling. Enough. Put me down, Storm. I've got to rest a minute or I'll pass out. Take Tass and I'll meet you upstairs. Go on, damn it. Sturm grabbed Tasselhoff by the collar and dragged him upstairs. Tanis sank back. Sweat chilled his body. Every breath was agony. Suddenly, the remainder of the floor in the Hall of the Ancestors collapsed with a loud, snapping noise. The temple of Mishikal trembled and shook. Tanis staggered to his feet. Then he paused a moment. Faintly, behind him, he could now hear the low, thundering rumble of water surging. Nusi had claimed Zakh-Tsaroth. The city that was dead was now buried. Tanis emerged slowly from the stairwell into the circular room at the top. The climb had been a nightmare, each new step a miracle. The chamber was blessedly quiet. The only sound the harsh breathing of his friends who had made it that far and collapsed. He too could go no farther. The half-elf glanced around to make certain the others were all right. Sturm had set down the pack containing the discs and was slumped against the wall. Raistlin lay on a bench, his eyes closed, his breathing quick and shallow. Of course, Karaman sat beside him, his face dark with anxiety. Tasselhoff sat at the bottom of the pedestal, staring up at the top. Flint leaned against the doors, too tired to grumble. Where's Riverwind? Tanis asked. He saw Karaman and Sturm exchange glances, then lower their eyes. Tanis staggered up, anger defeating his pain. Sturm rose and blocked his path. It's his decision, Tanis. It is the way of his people as it is the way of mine. Tanis shoved the knight aside and walked toward the double doors. Flint did not move. Get out of my way, the half-elf said, his voice shaking. Flint looked up. The lines of grief and sorrow etched by 100 years softened the dwarf's scowling expression. Tanis saw in Flint's eyes the accumulated wisdom that had drawn an unhappy half-human, half-elven boy into a strange and lasting friendship with a dwarf. Sit down, lad, Flint said in a gentle voice, as if he too remembered their origins. If your elven head cannot understand, then listen to your human heart for once. Tanis shut his eyes, tears stinging his lids. Then he heard a great cry from inside the temple. Riverwind. Tanis thrust the dwarf aside and pushed open the huge golden doors, striding rapidly, ignoring his pain. He threw open the second set of doors and entered the chamber of Mishikal. Once again he felt peace and tranquility flood over him. But now, the feelings only added to his anger over what had happened. I cannot believe in you, Tanis cried. What kind of gods are you, that you demand a human sacrifice? You are the same gods who brought the cataclysm down on man. All right, so you're powerful. Now leave us alone. We don't need you. The half-elf wept. Through his tears he could see that Riverwind, sword in hand, knelt before the statue. Tanis stumbled forward, hoping to prevent the act of self-destruction. Tanis rounded the base of the statue and stopped, stunned. For a minute, he refused to believe his own sense of sight. Perhaps grief and pain were playing tricks in his mind. He lifted his eyes to the statue's beautiful, calm face and steadied his reeling, confused senses. Then he looked again. Gold Moon lay there, sound asleep, her breast rising and falling with the rhythm of her quiet breathing. Her silver gold hair had come loose from its braid and drifted around her face in the gentle wind that filled the chamber with the fragrance of spring. The staff was once again part of the marble statue, but Tanis saw that Gold Moon wore around her throat the necklace that had once adorned the statue. I am a true cleric now, Gold Moon said softly. I am a disciple of Mishikar, and though I have much to learn, I have the power of my faith. Above all else, I am a healer. I bring the gift of healing back into the land. Reaching out her hand, Gold Moon touched Tanis on the forehead, whispering a prayer to Mishikar. The half-elf felt peace and strength flow through his body, cleansing his spirit and healing his wounds. We've got a cleric now, Flint said, and that'll come in handy. But from what we hear, this Lord Verminard's a cleric too, and a powerful one at that. He may have found the ancient gods of good, but he found the ancient gods of evil a lot sooner. I don't see how these discs are going to help much against hordes of dragons. You are right, Gold Moon said softly. I am not a warrior. I am a healer. I do not have the power to unite the peoples of our world to fight this evil and restore the balance. My duty is to find the person who has the strength and the wisdom for this task. I am to give the discs of Mishikal to that person. The companions were silent for long moments. Then, we must leave here, Tanis, Raistlin hissed from out of the shadows of the temple where he stood, staring out the door into the courtyard. Listen. Horns. They could all hear the shrill braying of many, many horns carried on the north wind. The armies, said Tanis softly. War has begun. The companions fled Zaroth into the twilight. They traveled west toward the mountains. The air was cold with the bite of early winter. Dead leaves, blown by chill winds, flew past their faces. They decided to head for Solace, planning to stock up on supplies and gather what information they could before determining where to go in their search for a leader. Tanis could foresee arguments along those lines. Already, Sturm was talking of Solamnia. Gold Moon mentioned Haven, while Tanis himself was thinking the discs of Mishikal would be safest in the Elven Kingdom. Discussing vague plans, they traveled on well into the night. They saw no Draconians and supposed that those escaping Zaroth had traveled north to join up with the armies of this Lord Verminard, Dragon High Master. The silver moon rose, then the red. The companions climbed high, the sound of the horns driving them on past the point of exhaustion. They made camp on the summit of the mountain. After eating a cheerless supper, not daring to light a fire, they set the watch, then slept. Raistlin woke in the cold gray hour before dawn. He had heard something. Had he been dreaming? No. There it was again. The sound of someone crying. Gold Moon, the mage, thought irritably, and started to lie back down. Then he saw Boo-Poo curled in a ball of misery, blubbering into a blanket. Raistlin glanced around. The others were asleep, except for Flint, standing watch on the other side of camp. The dwarf had apparently heard nothing, and he wasn't looking in Raistlin's direction. The mage stood up and padded softly over. Kneeling down beside the gully dwarf, he laid his hand on her shoulder. What is it, little one? Boo-Poo rolled over to face him. Her eyes were red, her nose swollen. Tears streaked down her dirty face. She snuffled and wiped her hand across her nose. "I don't want to leave you. I want to go with you," she said brokenly. "But, oh, I will miss my people." Sobbing, she buried her face in her hands. A look of infinite tenderness touched Raistlin's face, a look no one in his world would ever see. He reached out and stroked Boo-Poo's coarse hair, knowing what it felt like to be weak and miserable, an object of ridicule and pity. "Boo-Poo," he said, "you have been a good and true friend to me. You saved my life and the lives of those I care about. Now you will do one last thing for me, little one. Go back. I must travel roads that will be dark and dangerous before the end of my long journey. I cannot ask you to go with me." Boo-Poo lifted her head, her eyes brightening. Then a shadow fell across her face. "But you will be unhappy without me." "No," Raistlin said, smiling. "My happiness will lie in knowing you are back with your people." "You sure?" Boo-Poo asked anxiously. "I am sure," Raistlin answered. "Then I go." Boo-Poo stood up. "But first you take gear." She began to rummage around in her bag. "No, little one," Raistlin began, remembering the dead lizard. "That's not necessary." The words caught in his throat as he watched Boo-Poo pull from her bag a book. He stared in amazement, seeing the pale light of the chill morning illuminate silver runes on a night blue leather binding. Raistlin reached out a trembling hand. "The spell book of Fistandantalus," he breathed. "You like?" Boo-Poo said shyly. "Yes, little one." Raistlin took the precious object in his hands and held it lovingly, stroking the leather. "Where?" "I take from dragon," Boo-Poo said, "when blue light shine." "I glad you like. Now I go, find High Bulk Fudge the First, the Great." She slung her bag over her shoulder. Then she stopped and turned. "That cough. You sure you not want lizard cure?" "No, thank you, little one," Raistlin said, rising. Boo-Poo looked at him sadly, then, greatly daring, she caught his hands in hers and kissed him swiftly. She turned away, her head bowed, sobbing bitterly. Raistlin stepped forward. He laid his hand on her head. "If I have any power at all, great one," he said inside himself, "power that has not been revealed to me, grant that this little one goes through her life in safety and happiness. Farewell, Boo-Poo," he said softly. She stared at him with wide, adoring eyes, then turned and ran off as fast as her floppy shoes would carry her. "What was that all about?" Flint said, stumping over from the other side of the camp. "Oh," he added, seeing Boo-Poo running off. "So you got rid of your pet gully dwarf." Raistlin did not answer, but simply stared at Flint with a malevolence that made the dwarf shiver and walk hurriedly away. The mage held the spellbook in his hands, admiring it. He longed to open it and revel in its treasures, but he knew that long weeks of study lay ahead of him before he could even read the new spells, much less acquire them. And with the spells would come more power. He sighed in ecstasy and hugged the book to his thin chest. Then he slipped it swiftly into his pack with his own spellbook. The others would be walking soon. Let them wonder how he got the book. Raceland stood up, glancing out to the west, to his homeland, where the sky was brightening with the early morning sun. Suddenly he stiffened. Then, dropping his pack, he ran across the camp and knelt down beside the half-elf. "Tanis!" Raceland hissed. "Wake up!" Tanis woke and grabbed his dagger. "What?" Raceland pointed to the west. Tanis blinked, trying to focus his sleep-scummed eyes. The view from the top of the mountain where they were camped was magnificent. He could see the tall trees give way to the grassy plains, and beyond the plains, snaking up into the sky. "No!" Tanis choked. He gripped the mage. "No, it can't be." "Yes," Raceland whispered. "Solace is burning." Book 2, Chapter 1, Night of the Dragons. Tika wrung the rag out in the pail and watched, dully, as the water turned black. She threw the rag down on the bar and started to lift the bucket to carry it back to the kitchen to draw more water. Then she thought, why bother? Picking up the rag, she began to mop the tables again. When she thought Otik wasn't watching, she wiped her eyes with her apron. But Otik was watching. His pudgy hands took hold of Tika's shoulders and gently turned her around. Tika gave a choking sob and laid her head on his shoulder. "I'm sorry," Tika sobbed, "but I can't get this clean." Otik knew, of course, that this wasn't the real reason the girl was weeping, but it came close. He patted her back, gently. I know, child. Don't cry, I understand." "It's this damn soot," Tika wailed. "It covers everything with black, and every day I scrub it up, and the next day it's back. They keep burning and burning." "Don't worry about it, Tika," Otik said, stroking her hair. "Be thankful the inn's in one piece." "Be thankful?" Tika pushed away from him, her face flushed. "No, I wish it had burned like everything else in Solace. Then they wouldn't come in here. I wish it had burned. I wish it had burned." Tika sank down at the table, sobbing uncontrollably. Otik hovered around her. "I know, my dear, I know," he repeated, smoothing the puffy sleeves of the blouse Tika had taken such pride in keeping clean and white. Now it was dingy and covered with soot, like everything in the ravaged town. The attack on Solace had come without warning. Even when the first pitiable refugees began to trickle into the town from the north, telling horror stories of huge, winged monsters, Hedrick, the High Theocrat, assured the people of Solace that they were safe. Their town would be spared, and the people believed him because they wanted to believe him. And then came the Night of the Dragons. The inn was crowded that night, one of the few places people could go and not be reminded of the storm clouds hanging low in the northern skies. The fire burned brightly, the ale was rich, the spiced potatoes were delicious, yet even here the outside world intruded. Everyone talked loudly and fearfully of war. Hedrick's words soothed their fearful hearts. "We are not like these reckless fools to the north, who made the mistake of defying the might of the Dragon High Lords," he called out, standing on a chair to be heard. Lord Verminard has personally assured the Council of High Seekers in Haven that he wants only peace. He seeks permission to move his armies through our town so that he may conquer the elf lands to the south. And I say, more power to him. Hedrick paused for scattered cheering and applause. We have tolerated the elves in Qualinesti too long. I say, let this Verminard drive them back to Sylvanost or wherever they came from. In fact, Hedrick warmed to his subject. Some of you young men might consider joining the armies of this great lord. And he is a great lord. I have met him. He is a true cleric. I have seen the miracles he has performed. We will enter a new age under his leadership. We will drive the elves, dwarves, and other foreigners from our land. And there came a low, dull, roaring sound, like the gathering of the waters of a mighty ocean. Silence fell abruptly. Everyone listened, puzzled, trying to figure out what might make such a noise. Hedrick, aware that he had lost his audience, glanced around in irritation. The roaring sound grew louder and louder, coming closer. Suddenly, the inn was plunged into thick, smothering darkness. A few people screamed. Most ran for the windows, trying to peer out the few clear panes scattered among the colored glass. Go down and find out what's going on, someone said. It's so blasted dark I can't see the stairs, someone else muttered. And then it was no longer dark. Flames exploded outside the inn. A wave of heat hit the building with force enough to shatter windows, showering those inside with glass. The mighty Valenwood tree, which no storm on Kryn had ever stirred, began to sway and rock from the blast. The inn tilted. Tables scooted sideways. Benches slid down the floor to slam up against the wall. Hedrick lost his balance and tumbled off his chair. Hot coals spewed from the fireplace as oil lamps from the ceiling and candles from the tables started small fires. A high-pitched shriek rose above the noise and confusion, the scream of some living creature, a scream filled with hatred and cruelty. The roaring noise passed over the inn. There was a rush of wind, then the darkness lifted, as a wall of flames sprang up to the south. Tika dropped a tray of mugs to the floor as she grabbed desperately at the bar for support. People around her shouted and screamed, some in pain, some with terror. Solace was burning. A lurid orange glow lit the room. Clouds of black smoke rolled in through the broken windows. Smells of blazing wood filled Tika's nostrils, along with a more horrible smell, the smell of burnt flesh. Tika choked and looked up to see small flames licking the great limbs of the Valenwood that held up the ceiling. Sounds of varnish, sizzling and popping in the heat mingled with the screams of the injured. Douse those fires! Otik was yelling wildly. The kitchen! The cook screamed as she flew out of the swinging doors, her clothes smoldering. A solid wall of flame behind her. Tika grabbed a pitcher of ale from the bar and tossed it on the cook's dress, and held her still to drench her clothes. Rhea sank into a chair, weeping hysterically. Get out! The whole place will go up! Someone shouted. Hedrick, pushing past the injured, was one of the first to reach the door. He ran onto the inn's front landing, then stopped, stunned, and gripped the rail for support. Staring northward, he saw the woods blazing, and by the ghastly light of the flames he could see hundreds of marching creatures, the lurid firelight reflecting off their leathery wings. Draconian ground troops. He watched, horrified, as the front ranks poured into the city of Solace, knowing there must be thousands more behind them, and above them flew creatures out of the stories of children. Dragons. 5 red dragons wheeled overhead in the flame-lit sky. First one, then another dove down, incinerating parts of the small town with its fiery breath, casting the thick, magical darkness. It was impossible to fight them. Warriors could not see well enough to aim their arrows or strike with their swords. The rest of the night blurred in Tika's memory. She kept telling herself she must leave the burning inn, yet the inn was her home. She felt safe there, and so she stayed, though the heat from the flaming kitchen grew so intense it hurt her lungs to breathe. Just when the flames spread to the common room, the kitchen crashed to the ground. Otik and the barmaids flung buckets of ale on the flames in the common room until, finally, the fire was extinguished. Once the fire was out, Tika turned her attention to the wounded. Otik collapsed in a corner, shaking and sobbing. Tika sent one of the other barmaids to tend to him, while she began treating the injured. She worked for hours, resolutely refusing to look out of the windows, blocking from her mind the awful sounds of death and destruction outside. Suddenly, it occurred to her that there was no end to the wounded, that more people were lying on the floor than had been in the inn when it was attacked. Dazed, she looked up to see people straggling in. Wives helped their husbands. Husbands carried their wives. Mothers carried dying children. "What's going on?" Tika asked a seeker guard who staggered in, clutching his arm where an arrow had penetrated it. Others pushed behind him. "What's happening? Why are these people coming here?" The guard looked at her with dull, pain-filled eyes. "This is the only building," he mumbled. "All burning. All. No." Tika went limp with shock, and her knees trembled. At that moment, the guard fainted in her arms, and she was forced to pull herself together. The last thing she saw as she dragged him inside was Hedrick, standing on the porch, staring out over the flaming town with glazed eyes. Tears streamed unheeded down his soot-streaked face. "There's been a mistake," he whimpered, wringing his hands. "There's been a mistake made somewhere." That had been a week ago. As it turned out, the inn was not the only building left standing. The Draconians knew which buildings were essential to their needs and destroyed all those that were not. The inn, Pharaoh Seinfeld's blacksmith shop, and the general store were saved. The blacksmith shop had always been on the ground because of the inadvisability of having a hot forge located in a tree, but the others had to be lowered to the ground because the Draconians found it difficult to get into the trees. Lord Verminard ordered the dragons to lower the buildings. After a space had been scorched clear, one of the huge red monsters stuck his claws into the inn and lifted it. The Draconians cheered as the dragon dropped it, not gently, onto the blackened grass. Viewmaster Turner, in charge of the town, ordered Otik to repair the inn immediately. The Draconians had one great weakness, a thirst for strong drink. 3 days after the town was taken, the inn reopened. "I'm all right now," Tika told Otik. She sat up and dried her eyes, wiping her nose with her apron. "I haven't cried once since that night," she said, more to herself than to him. Her lips tightened into a thin line. "And I'll never cry again," she swore, rising from the table. Otik, not understanding, but thankful that Tika had regained her composure before the patrons arrived, bustled back behind the bar. "Nearly opening time," he said, trying to sound cheerful. "Maybe we'll have a good crowd today." "How can you take their money?" Tika flared. Otik, fearing another outburst, looked at her pleadingly. Their money is as good as anyone else's. Better than most these days, he said. Humph, Tika snorted. Her thick red curls quivered as she stalked angrily across the floor. Otik, knowing her temper, stepped backward. It didn't help. He was caught. She jabbed her finger into his fat stomach. How can you laugh at their crude jokes and cater to their whims? She demanded. I hate the stench of them. I hate their leers and their cold, scaly hands touching mine. Someday I'll... Tika, please, Otik begged. Have some regard for me. I'm too old to be carried off to the slave mines, and you... They'd take you tomorrow if you didn't work here. Please behave. There's a good girl. Tika bit her lip in anger and frustration. She knew Otik was right. She risked more than being sent off in the slave caravans that passed through town almost daily. An angered Draconian killed swiftly and without mercy. Just as she was thinking this, the door banged open and 6 Draconian guards swaggered in. One of them pulled the closed sign off the door and tossed it into a corner. Door open, the creature said, dropping into a chair. Yes, certainly. Otik grinned, weakly. Tika? I see them, Tika said, dully.
Bravo Chris, merci d'être passé. J'espère que tu passes une bonne journée.
Dully.
Definitely appreciate you stopping by.
Chapter 2. The Stranger. Captured. The crowd at the inn that night was sparse. The patrons were now Draconians, though occasionally Solace residents came in for a drink. They generally did not stay long, finding the company unpleasant and memories of former times hard to bear.
J'apprécie vraiment votre passage.
Tonight, there was a group of hobgoblins who kept wary eyes on the Draconians, and 3 crudely dressed.
You're a good one, Chris.
Humans from the north, originally impressed into Lord Verminard's service. They now fought for the sheer pleasure of killing and looting. A few Solace citizens sat huddled in a corner. Hedrick, the theocrat, was not in his nightly spot. Lord Verminard had rewarded the High Theocrat's service by placing him among the first to be sent to the slave mines. Near dusk, a stranger entered the inn, taking a table in a dark corner near the door. Tika couldn't tell much about him. He was heavily cloaked and wore a hood pulled low over his head. He seemed fatigued, sinking down into his chair as though his legs would not support him. What will you have? Tika asked the stranger. The man lowered his head, pulling down one side of his hood with a slender hand. Nothing, thank you, he said in a soft, accented voice. Is it permissible to sit here and rest? I'm supposed to meet someone. How about a glass of ale while you wait? Tika smiled. The man glanced up, and she saw brown eyes flash from the depths of his hood. Very well, the stranger said. I am thirsty. Bring me your ale. Tika headed for the bar. As she drew the ale, she heard more customers entering the inn. Just a half second, she called out, unable to turn around. Sit anywhere you've a mind. I'll be with you as soon as I can. She glanced over her shoulder at the newcomers and nearly dropped the mug. Tika gasped, then got a grip on herself. Don't give them away. Sit down anywhere, strangers, she said loudly. One of the men, a big fellow, seemed about to speak. Tika frowned fiercely at him and shook her head. Her eyes shifted to the Draconians, seated in the center of the room. A bearded man led the group past the Draconians, who examined the strangers with a great deal of interest. They saw 4 men and a woman, a dwarf and a kender. The men were dressed in mud-stained cloaks and boots. One was unusually tall, another unusually big. The woman was cloaked in furs and walked with her hand through the arm of the tall man. All of them seemed downcast and tired. One of the men coughed and leaned heavily upon a strange-looking staff. They crossed the room and sat down at a table in the far corner. "More refugees, scum," sneered a Draconian. "The humans look healthy, though, and all know dwarves are hard workers. Wonder why they haven't been shipped out. They will be soon as the Fumemaster sees them." "Perhaps we should take care of the matter now," said a third, scowling in the direction of the 8 strangers. "No, I'm off duty. They won't go far." The others laughed and returned to their drinking. A number of empty glasses already sat before each of them. Tika carried the ale to the brown-eyed stranger, set it before him hurriedly, then bustled back to the newcomers. "What'll you have?" she asked coldly. The tall, bearded man answered in a low, husky voice. "Ale and food," he said, "and wine for him." He nodded at the man who was coughing almost continually. The frail man shook his head. "Hot water," he whispered. Tika nodded and left. Out of habit, she started back toward where the old kitchen had been. Then, remembering it was gone, she whipped around and headed for the makeshift kitchen that had been built by goblins under Draconian supervision. Once inside, she astounded the cook by grabbing the entire skillet of fried, spiced potatoes and carrying it back out into the common room. "Ale all around and a mug of hot water," she called to Desra behind the bar. Tika blessed her stars that Otik had gone home early. "Itram, take that table." She motioned to the hobgoblins as she hurried back to the newcomers. She slammed the skillet down, glancing at the Draconians. Seeing them absorbed in their drinking, she suddenly flung her arms around the big man and gave him a kiss that made him flush. "Oh, Caraman," she whispered swiftly. "I knew you'd come back for me. Take me with you, please, please." "Now, there," Caraman said, patting her awkwardly on the back and looking pleadingly at Tanis. The half-elf swiftly intervened, his eyes on the Draconians. "Tika, calm down," he told her. "We've got an audience." "Right," she said briskly, and stood up, smoothing her apron. Handing plates around, she began to ladle out the spiced potatoes as Desra brought the ale and hot water. "Tell us, what happened to Solace?" Tanis said. His voice choked. Quickly, Tika whispered the story as she filled everyone's plate, giving Caraman a double portion. The companions listened in grim silence. "And so," Tika concluded, "every week the slave caravans leave for Pax Tharkas. Except now they've taken almost everyone, leaving only the skilled like Theros Ironfeld behind. I fear for him." She lowered her voice. "He swore to me last night that he would work for them no more. It all started with that captive party of elves." "Elves? What are elves doing here?" Tanis asked, speaking too loudly in his astonishment. The Draconians turned to stare at him. The hooded stranger in the corner raised his head. Tanis hunched
"Hey,
down
John
and
McDonald,
waited
how you doing?
until the Draconians turned their attention to their drinks.
I hope you're doing well.
Then he started
You know,
to
since
ask
you're
Tika
here,
more
let's
about
do
the
a dab.
elves. At that moment, a Draconian yelled for ale. Tika sighed. "I better go." She set the skillet down. "I'll leave that here. Finish them off." The companions ate listlessly, the food tasting like ashes. Raistland mixed his strange herbal brew and drank it down. His cough improved almost immediately. Karaman watched Tika as he ate, his expression thoughtful.
I'm
He
dabbing
could
some.
still feel the warmth of her body as she had embraced him, and the softness of her lips. Pleasant sensations flowed through him, and he wondered if the stories he had heard about Tika were true. The thought both saddened him.
Let's see what the name
Made
of
him
it
angry.
is.
One of the Draconians raised his voice. "We may
Some
not be
berries
men
and
like
cream.
you're accustomed to, sweetie," it said drunkenly, flinging its scaled arm around Tika's waist. "But that doesn't mean we can't find ways of making you happy." Karaman rumbled, deep in his chest. Sturm, overhearing, glowered and put his hand on his sword. Catching hold of the knight's arm, Tanis said urgently, "Both of you, stop it. We're in an occupied town. Be sensible. This is no time for chivalry. You too, Karaman. Tika can handle herself." Sure enough, Tika slipped deftly out of the Draconian's grip and flounced angrily into the kitchen. "Well, what do we do now?" Flint grumbled. "We came back to Solace for supplies and find nothing but Draconians. My house is little more than a cinder. Tanis doesn't even have a Valenwood tree, much less a home. All we've got are platinum discs of some ancient goddess and a sick mage with a few new spells." He ignored Raceland's glow. "We can't eat the discs, and the magician hasn't learned to conjure up food. So even if we knew where to go, we'd starve before we got there." "Should we still go to Haven?" Goldmoon asked, looking up at Tanis. "What if it is as
Yeah,
bad as
shit,
this?
hell yeah.
How do we know the
And
High
then
Secret
Adam,
Council is even in existence?"
Dr. Dabber
"I don't have
switch.
the answers," Tanis said, sighing. He rubbed his eyes with his hand. "But I think we should try to reach Qualinesti." Tasselhoff, bored by the conversation, yawned and leaned back in his chair. It didn't matter to him where they went. Examining the inn with intense interest, he wanted to get up and look where the kitchen had burned. But Tanis had warned him before they entered to stay out. The Kender contented himself with studying the other customers. He immediately noticed the cloaked stranger in the front of the inn, watching them intently as the conversation among the companions grew heated. Tanis raised his voice, and the word Qualinesti rang out again. The stranger set down his mug of ale with a thud.
Now put it on
Tass was
clean mode.
just about to call Tanis's attention to this when Tika came out of the kitchen and slammed food down in front of the Draconians, skillfully avoiding their clawed hands. Then she walked back over to the group. "Could I have some more potatoes?" Karaman asked. "Of course." Tika smiled at him and picked up the skillet.
Oh yeah, I won it in a raffle that they had last weekend.
He flushed and began to play with his fork. Qualinesti, Tanis reiterated, his voice rising as he contested a point with Sturm, who wanted to go north. Tass saw the stranger in the corner rise and start walking toward them. "Tanis, company?" the Kender said softly. The conversation ceased. Their eyes on their tankards. All of
Yeah,
them
but
could
last
feel
weekend,
and hear the approach of
at the
stranger.
tattoo convention we
Tanis cursed
had,
himself for not noticing him sooner.
they did
The Draconians, however,
a raffle.
had noticed the stranger.
They started on the
Just as he
first
reached
day
the creature's table,
of the
one of the
convention,
Draconians
and then on the
stuck out
last day of the
clawed
convention, they did the
foot. The
drawings for it.
stranger tripped over it,
But it was
stumbling headlong into a nearby table.
$10 a
Laughed
ticket.
loudly. Then, a
And all I did was
Draconian
buy
felt the
one
lips
ticket.
of the stranger's face. "Elf!" the Draconian hissed.
Bought one
Pulling off
ticket,
the
I
hood
ended up
to
winning.
reveal the
And that
almond-shaped
whole
eye,
setup is
slanted ears, and delicate, masculine features
it's
of
like
an elf lord.
almost $400
"Let me pass."
with tax. It would be about
The elf
400,
said,
maybe a
backing
little
up,
bit more.
his hands raised. "I was
But I won it for a
only going to exchange a word of greeting
$10
with this
raffle
guy."
ticket.
You'll exchange a word of greeting with the Viewmaster Elf. The Draconian snored.
Okay, since that's nice and
Jumping up and grabbing the stranger's the creature shoved the elf back up against the bar. The other two Draconians laughed loudly.
but
Tika,
it has a
on her way back to the
ceramic
kitchen with
bowl.
the skillet,
Let's see.
stalked over toward the
Or a
Draconians.
cup to let load.
"Stop this," she cried,
And then
taking
put
hold
in there.
of one of the Draconians by the arm. "Leave him alone. He's a paying customer, same as you. Go about your
Oh yeah,
business,
definitely.
girl." The Draconian
I wasn't
shoved Tika
gonna
aside,
complain.
then grabbed the elf with a clawed hand and hit him.
And the
twice
lights that you saw
across
on
the
there,
face. The blows drew blood.
like that
When
one,
the Draconian
you can
let
actually
go, the
switch
elf
those lights
sat,
to
shook his
single
head,
color, different types of
Kill
strobe, or
him!
ones like that.
Shouted one of the humans from the north. "Make him screech like the others!"
That and
Get his slanty eyes
like this
out of
part
his
right
head.
here.
That's what I'll do. The Draconian drew his sword. This has gone far enough.
They can actually
Stern
get different
rushed
style ones.
The others behind him, though all fear there was little hope of saving the elf. They were too far from him. But help was closer. With a shrill cry of rage, Tika Whalen brought her heavy iron skillet down on the Draconian's head.
Mhm.
There was a loud clunking.
That's definitely
The
gonna
Draconian stared stupidly at Tika.
have me going
for an
through my
instant,
my
then
wax a
slid
lot
to the
quicker
floor.
than I normally do.
The elf jumped forward.
'Cause I still
drawing a
got
knife as the other two Draconians leaped.
still
for
got old
Tika.
Faithful right here.
Sturm reached her side and clubbed one of the Draconians with his sword. Karaman caught the other
But
off
that
his straight
is
arms and tossed it over the bar. Riverwind
somewhat a little
turned
high
up about the door.
maintenance
Tannis cried,
because you gotta
seeing the hobgoblins leap up.
well you gotta
The
clean
plane
this
caught one
once in a
hobgoblin
while, but
as it put its
the
hand
inside
on the door,
where
but another escaped his grasp.
and watch this see if I can show
They
you
could hear it
guys.
shouting for the guard.
Like the
Tika,
inside
still
there.
wielding her skillet, thunked a hobgoblin
That's
over the
where
head.
you set
But
that
another
cup
hobgoblin,
at.
seeing Karaman charge
I gotta
over,
make sure
leaped out of the window.
well
Gold Moon rose to her feet. "Use your
I gotta
magic,"
make sure what's been
she
called
said to Raceland, grabbing him by the arm. "Do something." The mage looked at
that
the
part
wound
stays
coldly.
clean.
"It is hopeless," he whispered. "I will not waste my strength." Gold Moon glared at him in fury. But he had returned to his drink. Biting her lip, she ran over to Riverwind, the pouch with the precious discs of Mishikal in her arms. She could hear horns blowing wildly in the streets. "We've got to get out of here,"
But
Tannis
this
said.
I can use to
But
smoke
at that moment, one of the human
wax
fighters
or
wrapped his
flour.
arms around Tannis's neck, dragging him to the floor. Tasselhoff, with a wild shout, leaped onto the bar and began flinging mugs at the half-elf's attacker, narrowly missing Tannis in the process. Flint stood in the midst of the chaos, staring at the elfin stranger.
Old Faithful.
"I know you," he yelled suddenly. "Tannis, isn't this..."
But having that
hit the
I'm definitely
dwarf in the
gonna
head, knocking him
go
cold,
through my wax a lot
Oops.
quicker than I normally do.
said Taz. Tannis throttled the northerner and left him unconscious under a table. He grabbed Taz off the bar, set the kender on the floor, and knelt down beside Flint, who was groaning and trying to sit up. "Tannis, that elf," Flint blinked, groggily, then asked, "What hit me?" "That big guy under the table," Taz said, pointing. Tannis stood up and looked at the elf Flint indicated. "Gilfanas?" The elf stared at him. "Tantalas," he said coldly. "I would never have recognized you. That beard." Horns blew again, this time closer. "Great reorcs," the
Hell
dwarf
yeah.
groaned, staggering.
That's
to his
always
feet.
a good
"We've got
one.
to get out of here. Come on, out the back."
I'm kind of
There is no back.
Tika
playing the
cried
game
wildly,
on the
still
Switch
hanging on to the skip.
and have a
No.
movie going on this one.
Said a voice at the door. "There is no back. You are my prisoners." A blaze of torchlight flared into the room. The companions shielded their eyes, making out the forms of hobgoblins behind a squat figure in the doorway. The companions could hear the sounds of flapping feet outside. Then, what seemed like 100 goblins stared into the windows and peered in through the door. The hobgoblins inside the bar that were still alive or conscious picked themselves up and drew their weapons, regarding the companions hungrily. Sturm, don't be a
Look,
fool.
man with children's always a good one.
Catching hold of the knight as he prepared to charge into the seething mass of goblins, slowly forming a ring of steel around them. We surrender, the half-elf called out. Sturm glared at the half-elf in anger, and for a moment Tanis thought he might disobey. Please, Sturm. Tanis said quietly, trust me. This is not our time to die. Sturm hesitated
Then I got
and glanced around at the goblins crowding inside
these
the
two
inn.
to smoke on.
They stood back, fearful of his sword and his skill, but he knew they would charge in a rush if he made the slightest move. It is not our time to die. What odd words. Why had Tanis said them? Did a man
I'll be
ever
right
have
back,
time to
everyone.
die? If so, Sturm realized this wasn't it. Not if he could help it. There was no glory dying in an inn trampled by stinking, flapping goblin feet. Seeing the knight put his weapon away, the figure at the door decided it was safe to enter, surrounded as he was by 100 or so loyal troops. The companions saw the gray, mottled skin and red, squinting pig eyes of Viewmaster Turner. Tasselhoff gulped and moved quickly to stand beside Tanis. Surely he won't recognize us, Tass whispered. It was dusk when they stopped us, asking about the staff. Apparently, Turda did not recognize them. A lot had happened in a week's time, and the Viewmaster had important things stuffed in a mind already overloaded. His red eyes focused on the knight's emblems beneath Sturm's cloak. More refugee scum from Solan, Turda remarked. Yes, Tanis lied quickly. He doubted if Turda knew of the destruction of Zaxarov. He thought it highly unlikely that this Viewmaster would know anything about the discs of Mishika. But Lord Verminard knew of the discs, and he would soon learn of the dragon's death. Even a gully dwarf could add that one up. No one must know they came out of the east. We have journeyed long days from the north. We did not intend to cause trouble. These Draconians started it. Yes, yes, Turda said impatiently. I've heard this before. His squinty eyes suddenly narrowed. Hey, you! He shouted, pointing at Raceland. What are you doing? Skulking back there. Fetch him, lads. The Viewmaster took a nervous step behind the door, watching Raceland warily. Several goblins charged back, overturning benches and tables to reach the frail young man. Karaman rumbled deep in his chest. Tanis gestured to the warrior, warning him to remain calm. On your feet, one of the goblins snarled, prodding at Raceland with a spear. Raceland stood, slowly, and carefully gathered his pouches. As he reached for his staff, the goblin grabbed hold of the mage's thin shoulder. Touch me not, Raceland hissed, drawing back. I am Magi. The goblin hesitated and glanced back at Turda. Take him, yelled the Viewmaster, moving behind a very large goblin. Bring him here with the others. If ever a man wearing red robes was a magician, this country'd be overrun with rabbits. If he won't come peaceably, stick him. Maybe I'll stick him anyway, the goblin croaked. The creature held the tip of its spear up to the mage's throat, gurgling with laughter. Again, Tanis held Karaman back. Your brother can take care of himself, he whispered swiftly. Raceland raised his hands, fingers spread as though to surrender. Suddenly, he spoke the words, and pointed his fingers at the goblin. Small, brightly glowing darts made of pure white light beamed from the mage's fingertips, streaked through the air, and embedded themselves deep in the goblin's chest. The creature fell over with a shriek and lay writhing on the floor. As the smell of burning flesh and hair filled the room, other goblins sprang forward, howling in rage. "Don't kill him, you fools!" Turda yelled. The Viewmaster had backed clear out the door, keeping the big goblin in front of him as cover. "Lord Verminard pays a handsome bounty for magic users, but..." Turda was inspired. "The Lord does not pay a bounty for live kenders, only their tongues. Do that again, magician, and the kender dies." "What is the kender to me?" Raceland snarled. There was a long heartbeat of silence in the room. Tanis felt cold sweat chill him. Raceland could certainly take care of himself. Damn the mage. That was certainly not the answer Turda had expected either, and it left him not quite knowing what to do, especially since these big warriors still had their weapons. He looked almost pleadingly at Raceland. The magician appeared to shrug. "I will come peacefully," Raceland whispered, his golden eyes gleaming. "Just do not touch me." "No, of course not," Turda muttered. "Bring him." The goblins, casting uneasy glances in the direction of the Viewmaster, allowed the mage to stand beside his brother. "Is that everyone?" demanded Turda irritably. "Then take their weapons and their packs." Tanis, hoping to avoid more trouble, pulled his bow from his shoulder and laid it and his quiver on the soot-blackened floor of the inn. Tasselhoff quickly laid down his hookah. The dwarf, grumbling, added his battle axe. The others followed Tanis's lead, except Sturm, who stood, his arms folded across his chest, and... "Please let me keep my pack," Gold Moon said. "I have no weapons in it. Nothing of value to you, I swear." The companions turned to face her, each remembering the precious discs she carried. A strained, tense silence fell. Riverwind stepped in front of Gold Moon. He had laid his bow down, but he still wore his sword, as did the knight. Suddenly, Raceland intervened. The mage laid down his staff, his pouches of spell components, and the precious bag that contained his spell books. He was not worried about these. Spells of protection had been laid on the books. Anyone other than their owner attempting to read them would go insane. And the staff of Magius was quite capable of taking care of itself. Raceland held out his hands toward Gold Moon. "Give them the bag," he said gently. "Otherwise they will kill us." "Listen to him, my dear," called out Turda hastily. "He is an intelligent man." "He's a traitor," cried Gold Moon, clutching the pack. "Give them the pack," Raceland repeated, hypnotically. Gold Moon felt herself weakening, felt his strange power breaking her. "No," she choked. "This is our hope." "It will be all right," Raceland whispered, staring intently into her clear blue eyes. "Remember the staff. Remember when I touched it." Gold Moon blinked. "Yes," she murmured. "It shocked you." "Hush," Raceland warned swiftly. "Give them the pouch. Do not worry. All will be well. The gods protect their own." Gold Moon stared at the mage, then nodded reluctantly. Raceland reached out his thin hands to take the pouch from her. Viewmaster Turda stared at it greedily, wondering what was in it. He would find out, but not in front of all these goblins. Finally, there was only one person left who had not obeyed the command. Sturm stood unmoving, his face pale, his eyes glittering feverishly. He held his father's ancient two-handed sword tightly. Suddenly, Sturm turned, shocked to feel Raistlin's burning fingers on his arm. "I will ensure its safety," the mage whispered. "How?" the knight asked, withdrawing from Raistlin's touch as from a poisonous snake. "I do not explain my ways to you," Raistlin hissed. "Trust me or not, as you choose." Sturm hesitated. "This is ridiculous," shrieked Turda. "Kill the knight! Kill them if they cause more trouble! I'm losing sleep!" "Very well," Sturm said in a strangled voice. Walking over, he reverently laid the sword down on the pile of weapons. Its ancient silver scabbard, decorated with the kingfisher and rose, gleamed in the light. "Ah, truly a beautiful weapon," Turda said. He had a sudden vision of himself walking into the sword of a Solamnic knight hanging at his side. "Perhaps I should have taken that into custody myself. Bring it!" Before he could finish, Raistlin stepped forward swiftly and knelt beside the pile of weapons. A bright flash of light sprang from the mage's hand. Raistlin closed his eyes and began to murmur strange words, holding his outstretched hands above the weapons and packs. "Stop him!" yelled Turda. But none dared. Finally, Raistlin ceased speaking, and his head slumped forward. His brother hurried to help. Raistlin stood. "Know this," the mage said, his golden eyes staring around the common room. "I have cast a spell upon our belongings. Anyone who touches them will be slowly devoured by the great worm, Caterpillius, who will rise from the abyss and suck the blood from your veins until you are nothing more than a dried husk." "The great worm Caterpillius," breathed Tasselhoff, his eyes shining. "That's incredible! I've never heard of—" Tanis clapped his hand over the Kender's mouth. The goblins backed away from the pile of weapons, which seemed to almost glow with a green aura. "Get those weapons, somebody!" ordered Turda in a rage. "You get 'em!" muttered a goblin. No one moved. Turda was at a loss. Although he was not particularly imaginative, a vivid picture of the great worm Caterpillius reared up in his mind. "Very well," he muttered. "Take the prisoners away. Load them into the cages. Bring those weapons too, or you'll wish the worm, what's its name, was sucking your blood." Turda stomped off, angrily. The goblins began to shove their prisoners toward the door, prodding them in the back with their swords. None, however, touched Raistlin. "That's a wonderful spell, Raist," Caraman said in a low voice. "How effective is it? Could it—" "It's about as effective as your wit," Raistlin whispered, and held up his right hand as Caraman saw the telltale black marks of flash powder. He smiled grimly, in sudden understanding. Tanis was the last to leave the inn. He cast a final look around. A single light swung from the ceiling. Tables were overturned, chairs broken. The beams of the ceiling were blackened from the fires, in some cases burning through completely. The windows were covered with greasy black soot. "I almost wish I had died before I saw this." The last thing he heard as he left were two hobgoblin captains arguing heatedly about who was going to move The enchanted weapons. Chapter 3. The Slave Caravan. A strange old magician. The companions spent a chill, sleepless night, penned up in an iron-barred cage on wheels in the Solace town square. 3 cages were chained to one of the posts, driven into the ground around the clearing. The wooden posts were black from flame and heat, the bases scorched and splintered. No living thing grew in the clearing. Even the rocks were black and melted. When day dawned, they could see other prisoners in the other cages. The last slave caravan leaving Solace for Pax Tharkas. It was to be personally led by the Viewmaster himself, Turda having decided to take this opportunity to impress Lord Verminard, who was in residence at Pax Tharkas. Caraman tried once, during the cover of night, to bend the bars of the cage, and had to give up. A cold mist arose in the early morning hours, hiding the ravaged town from the companions. Tanis glanced over at Gold Moon and Riverwind. Now I understand them, Tanis thought. Now I know the cold emptiness inside that hurts worse than any sword thrust. My home is gone. He glanced over at Gilfanas, huddled in a corner. The elf had spoken to no one that night, excusing himself by begging that his head hurt and he was tired. But Tanis, who had kept watch all through the night, saw that Gilfanas did not sleep or even make a pretense of sleeping. He gnawed his lower lip and stared out into the darkness. The sight reminded Tanis that he had, if he chose to claim it, another place he could call home. Qualinesti. No, Tanis thought, leaning against the bars. Qualinesti was never home. It was simply a place I lived. Viewmaster Turda emerged from the mist, rubbing his fat hands together and grinning widely as he regarded the slave caravan with pride. There may be a promotion here, a fine catch, considering pickings were drying up in this burned-out shell of a town. Lord Verminard should be pleased, especially with this last batch. That large warrior, particularly, an excellent specimen. He could probably do the work of 3 men in the mines. The tall barbarian would do nicely, too. Probably have to kill the night, though. The Salamniks were notoriously uncooperative. But Lord Verminard will certainly enjoy the 2 females. Very different, but both lovely. Turda himself had always been attracted to the red-haired barmaid with her alluring green eyes, the low-cut white blouse purposefully revealing just enough of her lightly freckled skin to tantalize a man with thoughts of what lay beyond. The Viewmaster's reveries were interrupted by the sound of clashing steel and hoarse shouts floating eerily through the mist. The shouts grew louder and louder. Soon almost everyone in the slave caravan was awake and peering through the fog, trying to see. Turda cast an uneasy glance at the prisoners and wished he'd kept a few more guards handy. The goblins, seeing the prisoners stir, jumped to their feet and trained their bows and arrows on the wagons. "What's this?" Turda grumbled aloud. "Can't these fools even take one prisoner without all this turmoil?" Suddenly a cry bellowed above the noise. It was the cry of a man in torment and pain, but whose rage surpassed all else. Gilfanas stood up, his face pale. "I know that voice," he said. "Theros Ironfeld. I feared this. He's been helping elves escape ever since the slaughter. This Lord Verminard has sworn to exterminate the elves." Gilfanas watched Tanis's reaction. "Or didn't you know?" "No," Tanis said, shocked. "I didn't know. How could I?" Gilfanas fell silent, studying Tanis for long moments. Forgive me, he said at last. It appears I have misjudged you. I thought perhaps that was why you had grown the beard. Never. Tanis leaped up. How dare you accuse me? Tanis, cautioned Sturm. The half-elf turned to see the goblin guards crowding forward, their arrows trained at his heart. Raising his hands, he stepped back to his place just as a squadron of hobgoblins dragged a tall, powerfully built man into sight. I heard Theros had been betrayed, Gilthanas said softly. I returned to warn him. But for him, I never would have escaped solace alive. I was supposed to meet him in the inn last night. When he did not come, I was afraid. Viewmaster Turd threw open the door to the companion's cage, yelling and gesturing for the hobgoblins to hurry their prisoner forward. The goblins kept the other prisoners covered, while the hobgoblins threw Theros into the cage. Viewmaster Turd slammed the door shut quickly. That's it, he yelled. Hitch up the beasts. We're moving out. Squads of goblins drove huge elk into the clearing and began hitching them to the wagons. Their yelling and the confusion registered only in the back of Tanis's mind. For the moment, his shocked attention was on the smith. Theros Ironfeld lay unconscious on the straw-covered floor of the cage, where his strong right arm should have been, was a mangled stump. His arm had been hacked off, apparently by some blunt weapon, just below the shoulder. Blood poured from the terrible wound and pooled on the floor of the cage. Let that be a lesson to all those who help elves. The Viewmaster peered in the cage, his red pig eyes squinching in their pouches of fat. You won't be forging anything ever again, unless it be a new arm. Yeah! A huge elk lumbered into the Viewmaster, forcing him to scramble for his life. Turda turned on the creature leading the elk. System! You wolf! Turda knocked the smaller creature to the ground. Tasselhoff stared down at the creature, thinking it was a very short goblin. Then he saw it was a gully dwarf dressed in a goblin's armor. The gully dwarf picked himself up, shoved his oversized helm back, and glared after the Viewmaster, who was waddling up to the front of the caravan. Scowling, the gully dwarf began kicking mud in his direction. This apparently relieved his soul, for he soon quit and returned to prodding the slow elk into line. My faithful friend, Gilthanas murmured, bending over Theros and taking the smith's strong, black hand in his. You have paid for your loyalty with your life. Theros looked at him with vacant eyes, clearly not hearing the elf's voice. Gilthanas tried to stanch the dreadful wound, but blood continued to pump onto the floor of the cart. The smithy's life was emptying before their eyes. No, said Goldmoon, coming to kneel beside the smith. He need not die. I am a healer. Lady, Gilthanas said impatiently. There exists no healer on Kryn who could help this man. He has lost more blood than the dwarf has in his whole body. His life beat is so faint I can barely feel it. The kindest thing to do is let him die in peace, without any of your barbarian rituals. Goldmoon ignored him, placing her hand upon Theros's forehead. She closed her eyes. Mishikai, she prayed. Beloved goddess of healing, grace this man with your blessing. If his destiny be not fulfilled, heal him, that he may live and serve the cause of truth. Gilthanas began to remonstrate once more, reaching out to pull Goldmoon away. Then he stopped and stared in amazement. Blood ceased to drain from the smith's wound, and even as the elf watched, the flesh began to close over it. Warmth returned to the smith's dusky black skin. His breathing grew peaceful and easy, and he appeared to drift into a healthful, relaxed sleep. There were gasps and murmurs of astonishment from the other prisoners in the nearby cages. Tanis glanced around fearfully to see if any of the goblins or Draconians had noticed, but Apparently, they were all preoccupied with hitching the recalcitrant elk to the wagons. Gilthanas subsided back into his corner, his eyes on Gold Moon, his expression thoughtful. Tassel off. Pile up some of that straw. Tanis instructed. Caraman, you and Sturm help me move into a corner. Here. Riverwind offered his cloak. Take this to cover him from the chill. Gold Moon made certain Theros was comfortable, then returned to her place beside Riverwind. Her face radiated a peace and calm serenity that made it seem as if the reptilian creatures on the outside of the cage were the true prisoners. It was nearly noon before the caravan got underway. Goblins came by and threw some food into the cages, hunks of meat and bread. No one, not even Caraman, could eat the rancid, stinking meat, and they threw it back out. But they devoured the bread hungrily, having eaten nothing since last nightfall. Soon, Turda had everything in order, and, riding by on his shaggy pony, gave the orders to move out. The gully dwarf, Seston, trotted after Turda. Seeing the hunk of meat lying in the mud and filth outside the cage, the gully dwarf stopped, grabbed it eagerly, and crammed it into his mouth. Each wheeled cage was pulled by 4 elk. 2 hobgoblins sat high on crude wooden platforms, one holding the reins of the elk, the other a whip and a sword. Turda took his place at the front of the line, followed by about 50 Draconians dressed in armor and heavily armed. Another troop of about twice as many hobgoblins fell into line behind the cages. After a great deal of confusion and swearing, the caravan finally lurched forward. Some of the remaining residents of Solace stared at them as they drove off. If they knew anyone among the prisoners, they made no sound or gesture of farewell. The faces, both inside and outside the cages, were the faces of those who no longer can feel pain, like Tika. They had vowed never to cry again. The caravan traveled south from Solace, down the old road through Gateway Pass. The hobgoblins and Draconians grumbled about traveling in the heat of the day, but they cheered up and moved faster once they marched into the shade of the pass's high canyon walls. Although the prisoners were chilled in the canyon, they had their own reasons for being grateful. They no longer had to look upon their ravaged homeland. It was evening by the time they left the canyon's winding roads and reached Gateway. The prisoners strained against the bars for some glimpse of the thriving market town. But no, only 2 low stone walls melted and blackened, marked where the town might have once stood. No living creature stirred. The prisoners sank back in misery. Once more out in the open country, the Draconians announced their preference for traveling by night, out of the sun's light. Consequently, the caravan made only brief stops until dawn. Sleep was impossible in the filthy cages, jolting and jouncing over every rut in the road. The prisoners suffered from thirst and hunger. Those who managed to gag down the food the Draconians tossed them soon vomited it back up. They were given only small cups of water, 2 or 3 times a day. Gold Moon remained near the injured smithy. Although Theros Ironfeld was no longer at the point of death, he was still very ill. He developed a high fever, and in his delirium, he raved about the sacking of Solace. Theros spoke of Draconians whose bodies, when dead, turned into pools of acid, burning the flesh of their victims, and of Draconians whose bones exploded after death, destroying everything within a wide radius. Tanis listened to the smith relive horror after horror until he felt sick. For the first time, Tanis realized the enormity of the situation. How could they hope to fight dragons whose breath could kill, whose magic exceeded that of all but the most powerful magic users who had ever lived? How could they defeat vast armies of these Draconians, when even the corpses of the creatures had the power to kill? All we have, Tanis thought bitterly, are the discs of Mishikal. And what good are they? He had examined the discs during their journey from Zaktsaroth to Solace. He had been able to read little of what was written, however. Although Gold Moon had been able to understand those words that pertained to the healing arts, she could decipher little more. All will be made clear to the leader of the people, she said with steadfast faith. My calling now is to find him. Tanis wished he could share her faith, but as they traveled through the ravaged countryside, he began to doubt that any leader could defeat the might of this Lord Verminard. These doubts merely compounded the half-elf's other problems. Raistlin, bereft of his medicine, coughed until he was nearly in as bad a state as Theros, and Gold Moon had 2 patients on her hands. Fortunately, Tika helped the plainswoman tend the mage. Tika, whose father had been a magician of sorts, held anyone who could work magic in awe. In fact, it had been Tika's father who inadvertently introduced Raistlin to his calling. Raistlin's father took the twin boys and his stepdaughter, Kitiara, to the local Summer's End festival, where the children watched the wonderful Waylon perform his illusions. 8-year-old Karaman was soon bored and readily agreed to accompany his teenage half-sister to the event that attracted her, the swordplay. Raistlin, thin and frail even then, had no use for such active sports. He spent the entire day watching Waylon, the illusionist. When the family returned home that evening, Raistlin astounded them by being able to duplicate flawlessly every trick. The next day, his father took the boy to study with one of the great masters of the magic arts. Tika had always admired Raistlin, and she had been impressed by the stories she heard about his mysterious journey to the fabled Towers of High Sorcery. Now she helped care for the mage out of respect, and her own innate need to help those weaker than herself. She also tended him, she admitted privately to herself, because her deeds won a smile of gratitude and approval from Raistlin's handsome twin brother. Tanis wasn't certain which to worry about most, the worsening condition of the mage or the growing romance between the older, experienced soldier and the young and, Tanis believed, despite gossip to the contrary, inexperienced, vulnerable barmaid. He had another problem as well. Sturm, humiliated at being taken prisoner and hauled through the countryside like an animal to slaughter, lapsed into a deep depression from which Tanis thought he might never escape. Sturm either sat all day, staring out between the bars, or, perhaps worse, he lapsed into periods of deep sleep from which he could not be wakened. Finally, Tanis had to cope with his own inner turmoil, physically manifested by the elf sitting in the corner of the cage. Every time he looked at Gilthanas, Tanis's memories of his home in Qualinesti haunted him. As they neared his homeland, the memories he had thought long buried and forgotten crept into his mind. Their touch, every bit as chilling as the touch of the undead in Darken Wood. Gilthanas, childhood friend, more than friend, brother. Raised in the same household and close to the same age. The two had played and fought and laughed together. When Gilthanas's little sister grew old enough, the boys allowed the captivating blonde child to join them. One of the threesome's greatest delights was teasing the older brother, Porthios, a strong and serious youth who took on the responsibilities and sorrows of his people at an early age. Gilthanas, Lorana, and Porthios were the children of the Speaker of the Suns, the ruler of the elves of Qualinesti, a position Porthios would inherit at his father's death. Some in the Elven Kingdom thought it odd that the speaker would take into his house the bastard son of his dead brother's wife after she had been raped by a human warrior. She had died of grief only months after the birth of her half-breed child. But the speaker, who had strong views on responsibility, took in the child without hesitation. It was only in later years, as he watched with growing unease the developing relationship between his beloved daughter and the bastard half-elf, that he began to regret his decision. The situation confused Tanis as well. Being half-human, the young man acquired a maturity the slower developing elf maid could not understand. Tanis saw the unhappiness their union must bring down upon the family he loved. He also was beset by the inner turmoil that would torment him later in life. A constant battle between the elvish and the human within him. At the age of 80, about 20 in human years, Tanis left Corlinost. The speaker was not sorry to see Tanis leave. He tried to hide his feelings from the young half-elf, but both of them knew it. Gilthanas had not been so tactful. He and Tanis had exchanged bitter words over Lorana. It was years before the sting of those words faded, and Tanis wondered if he had ever truly forgotten or forgiven. Clearly, Gilthanas had done neither. The journey for these two was very long. Tanis made a few attempts at desultory conversation and became immediately aware that Gilthanas had changed. The young elf lord had always been open and honest, fun-loving and light-hearted. He did not envy his older brother the responsibilities inherent in his role as heir to the throne. Gilthanas was a scholar, a dabbler in the magic arts, though he never took them as seriously as Raistlin. He was an excellent warrior, though he disliked fighting, as do all elves. He was deeply devoted to his family, especially his sister. But now he sat, silent and moody, an unusual characteristic in elves.
All right, everyone, gonna
The only time he showed any interest
call
in
into
anything
this
was
live.
when Caraman
I
had
didn't
begun
realize
plotting an escape.
how late it was already. But I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Till next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe out there.